Well, another Monday is here, and this is part 2 of the Jeep Cherokee story. This is the same Jeep, and it showed up about 3 years later for a different problem. And so the new concern was that it would misfire intermittently. It only did it sometimes. It would just start running rough, and he could switch it off and restart it. He told me when he finally brought it over there, everything would be okay. It had run just fine when the soldier drove it over there to the college. And I just figured I'd open the hood and take a quick look. I didn't really see anything when I looked under there. Remember, this is the same one that we had pulled the engine out of and put cam bearings and stuff in it to take care of that oil pressure problem that I talked about last week. Same vehicle. This one here, incidentally, has got this coil rail that's long and unusual. And one of the things you got to be careful about with these coil rails is they're not all the same. From one year model to the next, you may find out that, let's say if you just grab one of these coil rails that you have laying there that you know is good, and you put it on a vehicle that is that wasn't the same year model, and we've had this happen, the thing will act like it's got crossed plug wires because it fires the primaries in a different order on some of them for some strange reason. On the Fords, whenever you've got the coil pack, some of those coil packs, if the connector is pointing up on a Ford coil pack instead of out to the side, you cannot interchange those coil packs even though the connector will plug in, because it's going to act like it's got crossed plug wires, because it's not firing the coils in the same order. So just be aware of that. So make sure when you get one of these coil rails, you're getting the right one for the right Jeep. We put an engine in a Jeep, and when the engine that we put in the Jeep, we just had the coil rail that was on it. When we plugged it in, it was terrible. So we took the coil rail off the engine, we pulled out of the Jeep and put it on there, and it fired right up. Just be careful that you know about that. Now this little cam synchronizer goes where the distributor used to go, and it's got this little vane that whirls around and gives a 50% duty cycle signal to the engine controller. And I have noticed that these things sometimes will seize up, and when they seize up, they'll basically bust the gears down there, and the vehicle will quit running, you know, because one of these Jeeps won't run with the well, this kind of Jeep won't run with the cam sensor unplugged, as I remember, but the earlier ones that had a distributor would. There was a friend of mine that wasn't really familiar with these Jeeps all that much, and he just unplugged the wires from the distributor thinking he had killed the ignition system because he had a bunch of gas in the cylinders out there in the service light. Pulled all the plugs out and he unplugged that. He should have unplugged the crank sensor, and that would have killed the ignition system, but he unplugged the wire to the distributor. When he spun it over, there was big misty balls of burning gas that came blowing out of the spark plug hole. It looked like an anti-aircraft gun out there in the parking lot. I mean, it didn't burn anything up, but it was funny as hell. Scared the daylights out of him. And so we drove it. At first it started bucking like it had a spark plug leaking past the plug boot, but the further we went, the worse it ran. And he says, all you got to do is switch it off and switch it back on, and it clears this up. Well, see, that right there indicates it's some kind of a computer problem. You know, I've seen transmissions that would shift crazy, and when you switched it off and switched it and cranked it back up, they would shift normal for a while until they decided to do that again. So as I investigated this, I found out when it was really running bad that only 2 of the 6 cylinders were firing. 3 and 4 were the only ones that were firing. And it's amazing that this 6-cylinder, this cast iron straight 6 would even run with just 2 cylinders firing, but it was still running. And I don't know if it would run on 2 and 5 or 1 and 6, but it was running on 3 and 4. When we restarted it, the problem disappeared, you know, because it stalled while I was doing my troubleshooting. And I was unplugging injectors to find the ones that weren't firing, because you can't pull the plug wires off if it's got that coil rail on it. So I basically had to, you know, the injectors were easy to get to, and so that's the way I did it. That's a little safer than pulling plug wires anyway. When else, a lot of, you know, a lot of vehicles now you can actually use your scan tool to kill cylinders, and whenever you're doing a, you know, cylinder by cylinder power balance test like that. You know, for years we pulled the plug wires at the distributor cap and all that, listening for differences. Anyway, we got a P0353 and a P1391. Now both of those are significant, but the coil primary circuit fault was kind of what I was leaning toward, because it was dropping companion cylinders. And I was thinking, well, the coil rail assembly must be having a problem here, based on the fact that the dead cylinders were companion. Fires in 1 and 6 are fired by one coil, because both those pistons are coming up together. 2 and 5, 3 and 4. See, all those are coming up at the same time. I mean, in pairs. One of them on compression and one on exhaust. And the coil, the spark plug fires on both of those strokes. That's why they call it a waste spark system, because the spark plug fires during the exhaust stroke. Alright, so we replaced the coil rail because of the companion cylinders dropping out. it was just a Hail Mary pass, but it turned out that nothing changed when we did that. And so I said, well, we got to go a little deeper. So I studied the scan tool cam and crank counters, thinking about that other code, trying to get a feel for what I was looking at. The problem is, if you're not used to looking at these on one that's running right, then you really won't know how to recognize one that's not running right, even if the pattern shows up on the screen. That was something I learned when I was using the service bay diagnostic system at the Ford dealership between 91 and 2000. If I didn't know, sometimes I'd have to plug the, take a recording on another vehicle like the one I was working on that was working right, and compare that recording to the one that wasn't working right. And so a lot of the times when you do that, the problem jumps right out. Well, this one looks this way, and this one here, I see now what's going on. But just looking at it and instantly knowing without any frame of reference in your mind is something that's just not feasible. Smart as anybody may be, they're not going to be able to just glance at a scope pattern like some kind of a savant and say, oh, I see what the problem is there. Well, I drove it to lunch, and it started misfiring about the time I got back to the shop. And it was companion cylinders again, but this time, you might notice, 3 and 4 were the guilty parties. See? And so I said, well, it wasn't choosy. It would sometimes misfire on 1 and 6, 2 and 5, or 3 and 4, but it was always companions, which was very strange. Okay, so I did getting close to the end of the week, so I did an ABA swap test on the PCM by putting the PCM of that faulty vehicle on mine. I had my PCM just still mounted to the side, and I just plugged that other one in. And I drove it all the way home and all the way back. Never had any kind of a problem. And so mine ran great. Now the smart way of doing that is to take the suspected bad PCM and put it on a good vehicle, because a bad PCM doesn't really have any way it can destroy a good vehicle. Now there may be some caveats there, but I have found some like that. But if you take a good PCM and put it on a bad vehicle, you can destroy a good PCM if there's something wrong with the bad vehicle that fried the good PCM. So bad PCM, good vehicle, if it runs the same way, you've condemned the PCM. See, because everything else is different. The PCM is all that's changed. Anyway, that's been my strategy for a long time. So the Jeep had deteriorated by this point that the problem was just about always present, even with the engine cold. As soon as the throttle was open, it would start and dropping injector pulses on pairs of cylinders and that kind of thing. When it's a good thing that the problem is getting worse, because when it gets worse and it's doing it all the time, you can find it. If it only does it every 30 or 40 miles for 10 seconds, you're going to have a terrible time finding that problem. Well, I put a different coil primary connector on it using an overlay, and I wired up a 1998 Ford Explorer coil pack so that the Jeep could run on that. Some of my students, even some of the older ones, that I was training, that were in their 40s, were totally astonished that I could take that Ford coil and crank that Jeep with it. But I drove it with this Ford Explorer coil mounted on it, and I could also, because of the fact that I had plug wires now, I could actually use my secondary scope, and I could look at it. And notice these crazy stuff I got. I got multiple sparks. Now this is not a multi-strike system. but I was getting multiple sparks on this thing, and this one here was really screwy looking. And I was thinking, well, what in the world does this mean? I was just totally bumfuddled by that. You know, sometimes, and I worked on this thing for about a week, you know, before we finally got to the conclusion of it. It was rough. So I used the Intero PDA, which was a scope I had that I really loved. It cost a couple $1,000. That eventually died. It was an American-made scope too. But I checked the current ramping pattern on the coils. I found out each coil was intermittently giving 2 current ramps. And once again, that's not supposed to happen. And so now I've only got one set of current ramps on here. I was measuring all the current ramps, and the way you do that is you take your little all 3 of the wires that are feeding the 3 coils on the coil pack, and you run them all through your same little inductive probe. I had a picture of that and forgot to put it in here. And because of the fact that it's ramping the coils at different times, you automatically have a nice parade pattern that way. And so just, you know, think about that. Anyway, the phone rang. It was Glenn Young. He was a guy that I knew down in Houston that I had taught some electronic diesel classes for, you know, his little training company down there years ago, and I bought equipment from him. And so I said, well, you know, Glenn's pretty sharp. So I said, Glenn, you know, what do you think about this? I told him about it. He said, well, when I get to the end of my thinking on something like that, I always look at the cam and crank synchronization, and I check it with a scope. And I says, well, I don't see anywhere, and this was in those days, where the way it's supposed to look is published. Now, doofy me, I could have actually scoped my own Cherokee, my own yellow one, and got a good pattern that way. But he told me what the pattern was supposed to look like. The pattern we got was the one you see right here. We found this pattern. Now, this is an example of what I was talking about. If you don't know that this pattern is not right, you're not going to know that you need to do anything to change it. See, because just looking at this subjectively, you're thinking, well, I don't really see anything here. You know, so what's it supposed to look like? Well, he described to me what it was supposed to look like. And the way you move it is, whenever you turn the cam synchronizer, as if you were setting the timing on a distributor, this will move in relation to this, because this is a crank sensor, this is a cam sensor, and this right here is actually supposed to be making its cut halfway between 2 of these, you know, these 4 fire. It's supposed to be making its switch halfway between there. So after we adjusted it, it looked like that. See, that's the way it's supposed to look. Just about halfway. Now that one there still needed a little more tweaking, but we adjusted the cam synchronizer to get this pattern here. You notice how this thing is right here, and before it was lined up with these 2. And so that was when we got that scope set up and started the engine and saw that pattern, we fixed it. Now this trouble could have been fixed with a toothpick. And I'm, you know, telling myself how silly I am on that. And I even mentioned that when I wrote a Motor Age article about it, and I'll say something about that in a minute. But what you do, you get this thing on number 1, top dead center compression on 0. Now some of them won't have this fancy wheel here. They'll just have a little notch so you can line up number 1. But you got to make sure you put your finger in that number 1 spark plug hole, bump it over until it goes puff, and then bring it on up to where to where you're on 0 there, which is what is really important. Okay, so once you got that thing lined up on 0, then you come around here to this cam synchronizer, and you might notice there's a hole bored in here, and there's another hole in this cup. And so what you're supposed to do is adjust it so that you can stick a toothpick. I used a stiff piece of wire through that hole. When you lock it down right there, when I tested that thing, I found out that if you set this cam sensor up this way on one of these Jeep 4 liters, you're going to have the exact pattern that I had on that scope. And so the long and the short of it was I worked on this thing for a week trying to figure this out, and that's all I really needed to do to fix it. A lot of the times you're overthinking it and the problem is simpler than you think it is. Now, why did the diagnostic trouble codes lead us astray? I like to talk about that. This problem had nothing to do with any coil primary fault, even though this engine controller was giving us coil primary faults. That's the side of the coil that triggers the secondary to fire, right? So I'm getting these and I'm thinking, well, you know, it has to have something to do with that because it's dropping companions, and the coil packs, there's 3 of them, they fire companion cylinders. You know, you just start thinking that in your mind, but it turned out it was leading us in the wrong direction. The companion cylinders were dropping out together, and that's what led us astray. Now this is a little follow-up. When I published this in Motor Age, some of you guys might know who Mac Van Wingeren is, or I'm not Van Vandenbrink, I'm sorry, I knew another guy named Van Wingeren, but it was published in Motor Age, and this brilliant scope guru, and he's passed away now, but he was a really sharp guy. This guy could look at the scope pattern, secondary ignition scope pattern, and he could tell you if your cam lobe was rounded off by looking at that. I mean, that's how sharp he was, and he was probably one of the foremost secondary ignition scope people I've ever known anybody even talking about. But he sent me one of his scope training course DVDs in an envelope along with a cute little note, and he also sent me a toothpick. I thought that was just really a nice little gesture on his part. Well, I was in a class at KZ Vision where G. Truly, a lot of you guys may know him, was talking about a Grand Cherokee with the same problem I described here, and I told him I had written about one of these, and he said, I know, I read your article. He was talking about a Grand Cherokee with the same engine in it that had been in the shop for like 6 weeks, and they had split all the wire harnesses and just made a big mess looking for this problem. Hadn't found anything, and all it needed doing was that little cam synchronizer. Now, we didn't split harnesses and all that junk, but it did take us a week to find something. So if you go back to basics and you check your cam synchronization to start with, you might save yourself a lot of trouble, especially if you've got one that's intermittently and randomly dropping those cylinders. Now I'm thinking what the deal was, we did the work before, and you know, 3 years later, a lot of miles, timing chain stretch. Since the timing chain, you know, is driven by the crankshaft via the camshaft, and the camshaft drives the synchronizer. As the timing chain stretches, if that synchronizer was on the cusp of not quite being right, then it worked its way into a position to where the engine controller was being confused, and it was causing all of these misfiring problems. Well, I hope you enjoyed part 2, and this is going to be the conclude this video today. And hey, let's be careful out there.